Texas, December 1944. Snow was impossible here, but cold had come anyway, turning the prairie into something hard and brittle under a sky clear as glass. 10 German women stood in the yard at dawn, hands raw from months of labor, waiting for work assignments like every morning before. Ranch foreman Tom Mackenzie approached with something they didn't expect without orders, but words that made no sense. Today you rest. It's Christmas. They had been prisoners for 8 months, had expected nothing but work until the war ended. What happened that evening at the dinner table would break them open in ways captivity never had, would show them grace they thought had died in the war. The 10 women had arrived at the Cross T Ranch in April 1944, transported from the processing center in San Antonio under military escort. They were nurses and clerks captured in North Africa when German forces collapsed under Allied pressure, women who had volunteered to serve the regime and now found themselves prisoners 8,000 miles from home. The ranch sat 40 miles northwest of San Antonio, 15,000 acres of grazing land that rolled away toward horizons so distant they seemed invented. Wire fences stretched for miles. Windmills turned slow against empty sky. Mesquite trees twisted by wind-marked property lines older than the war, older than anyone could remember. Tom Mackenzie, the foreman, was 53 years old and had been running the Cross T for almost 3 decades. His sons were overseas, one in France, one in the Pacific, and labor shortages had made managing the ranch nearly impossible. When the government offered prisoner workers, he accepted with reluctance and curiosity in equal measure. He had fought in the previous war, had seen enough of killing to last several lifetimes, and held complicated feelings about Germans that didn't quite align with simple hatred or forgiveness. The women arrived exhausted and weary. The tallest was Marguerite Fisher, 31 years old, who had been a surgical nurse in Hamburg before the war. The youngest, Anna Keller, was barely 22, a clerk who had kept supply records for field hospitals. Between them were 8 other women whose skills ranged from practical to specialized, whose backgrounds spanned from wealthy Berlin families to farming villages in Bavaria. They expected cruelty. The propaganda had been explicit about American treatment of prisoners, had promised harsh labor and deliberate starvation, had painted a picture of captivity as slow destruction. Instead, they found work that was hard, but not impossible, food that was adequate, if not generous, and treatment that was firm, but not cruel. The ranch house was adobe and timber, built low against the prairie wind, surrounded by outbuildings and corrals where horses moved like liquid shadows in evening light. The women were housed in a converted bunkhouse, clean and basic, with cots and a wood stove and windows that looked out toward landscape so vast it hurt to see. The work began immediately. The women were divided into teams based on their abilities and the ranch's needs. Some worked in the gardens, coaxing vegetables from soil that seemed too hard and dry to support life. Others helped with the chickens and pigs, feeding and cleaning with efficiency, born from desperation to be useful. The strongest were taught to help with cattle work, not riding yet, but feeding, basic medical care for sick animals, repair of fences and equipment. Mackenzie's wife, Ruth, was 60 years old and had raised 4 children on this ranch. She supervised the women with eyes that missed nothing and a mouth that rarely smiled but never sneered. She taught them English in the evenings, practical words for ranch work at first, then gradually expanding to conversation. She corrected their grammar without cruelty and their mistakes without mockery. The women learned American work songs from the ranch hands men too old for military service or too essential to ranching to be spared. They learned to judge weather by the sky's color and the cattle's behavior. They learned that in Texas, distance was measured in time rather than miles. That water was more valuable than almost anything, that silence between people didn't always signal hostility. Marguerite emerged as the unofficial leader among the women. She spoke the best English, having studied it in school before the regime changed what was taught and how. She translated not just words but meanings, helped the younger women understand instructions and expectations. She also served as mediator when tensions rose between the women themselves, between prisoners and their captors, between memory of home and reality of captivity. Anna struggled most with the adjustment. She was young enough to have known only the regime's version of Germany, old enough to have believed its promises completely. Her world had been binary: German superiority and everyone else's inferiority, regime truth and enemy lies. The Cross T Ranch didn't fit into those categories. The Americans weren't cruel, but they weren't weak either. The work was hard, but they weren't being worked to death. The cognitive dissonance created a kind of emotional paralysis that made everything harder than it needed to be. One evening in June, after a particularly long day repairing fence line in brutal heat, Anna sat on the bunkhouse steps and wept with exhaustion and confusion. Ruth found her there and sat beside her without speaking. After several minutes, Ruth said in careful German, "This is hard." "I know, but you're stronger than you think." Anna looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. "Why are you kind to us? We were your enemies." "Were," Ruth repeated, emphasizing the past tense. "War makes people into enemies who might otherwise have been friends. I won't hate you for choices you made when you were barely old enough to understand what you were choosing." Summer turned to autumn, and the women became part of the ranch's rhythm. They learned which tasks came with each season, which cattle needed special attention, which horses would tolerate inexperienced handlers. They learned the names of the ranch hand's old Charlie, who had worked cattle for 50 years, young James, who was 4F due to childhood polio, Miguel, whose family had ranched this land before it was Texas. The work changed them physically. Hands that had been soft became calloused. Bodies that had grown thin during the final months in Africa and during transport began filling out with muscle. Faces that had been pale took on the bronze of hours spent under relentless sun. But the psychological changes ran deeper. Slowly, incrementally, their expectations confronted reality. They had been taught Americans were soft, made weak by diversity and democracy. Yet they watched old Charlie work cattle with a skill that bordered on artistry, watched Mackenzie make decisions with quiet authority that needed no force behind it, watched Ruth manage the household and the ranch's domestic operations with efficiency that would shame any German administrator. They had been taught that captivity meant degradation, yet they were treated as workers rather than slaves, as people rather than objects. When Marguerite caught a fever in August, she was taken to the ranch house and cared for by Ruth with the same attention she would give family. When Anna injured her hand on barbed wire, Mackenzie drove for 20 miles to a doctor who cleaned and bandaged the wound without asking whether she was prisoner or citizen. These small acts of basic human decency accumulated weight. Each one created friction against the propaganda they had carried, wearing away certainty through the persistent abrasion of contradiction. In September, the Red Cross facilitated the first letters between the women and their families in Germany. The news was universally devastating. Cities bombed beyond recognition. Families scattered or gone. The war grinding toward defeat that seemed inevitable to everyone except the regime's most desperate leadership. Marguerite learned that her hospital in Hamburg had been destroyed in a firebombing, that colleagues she had trained with were dead or missing. Her parents had survived, but were living in a cellar with 11 other families, sharing 2 rooms and a single stove. Anna's letter from her mother described the village she had grown up in, now occupied by Allied forces pushing east. The farm was gone, requisitioned for military purposes, and her father had been conscripted into the final desperate levies despite being 56, years old and nearly blind in one eye. The letters were read and reread until the paper grew soft and fragile. The women passed them around, translating sections for each other, finding in shared grief a kind of community that transcended individual stories. They were all caught in the same catastrophe, all victims of decisions made by people who had promised glory and delivered only destruction. Ruth found Marguerite sitting alone near the horse corral one evening, holding her mother's letter as the sun set in colors that seemed too beautiful for a world containing such suffering. "Bad news?" Ruth asked quietly. "Everything is gone," Marguerite said in English that had become nearly fluent. "My city, my hospital, everything I knew. My parents are alive, but living in ruins. And here I am, safe, fed, working on a ranch in Texas while my country destroys itself." Ruth sat on the fence rail beside her. "You feel guilty for surviving. Shouldn't I?" "No," Ruth said firmly. "You didn't start this war. You didn't make the decisions that led to your city being bombed. You're just a person who got caught up in something too big to control. Being safe and fed isn't something to feel guilty about. It's something to be grateful for." "But my parents would want you to survive," Ruth interrupted gently. "Would want you to be exactly where you are, safe and fed and waiting for the day you can go home and help rebuild what was destroyed." As December approached, the ranch began preparing for Christmas in ways the women found confusing and fascinating. Ruth started baking weeks in advance cookies and pies and breads that filled the ranch house with smells that seemed to carry entire seasons in their sweetness. The hands cut a juniper tree from the hills and brought it to the house, where it was decorated with ornaments made over decades, each one carrying a story. The women had celebrated Christmas in Germany, but those celebrations had been increasingly militarized by the regime, turned into propaganda opportunities about strength and sacrifice. The version taking shape on the Cross T Ranch felt different, quieter, more intimate, focused on family and tradition rather than national glory. Mackenzie called the women together one evening in mid-December and explained through Marguerite's translation that Christmas on the ranch was a big celebration. The Hands and their families came for dinner. The day was set aside for rest and gathering rather than work. He paused, then added something that made the women exchange uncertain glances. The prisoners were invited to join the celebration. Kana spoke up in halting English. "We are prisoners. We cannot celebrate with you. Can't or won't." Mackenzie asked, not unkindly. "It is not proper." Anna struggled to find words. "We are enemies. The war's not fought on Christmas Day," Mackenzie replied. "Least not on this ranch. You're welcome at the table if you want to come. No obligation, no pressure. Just an invitation to spend the day like human beings instead of prisoner and guard." The women discussed this late into the night, their voices low and urgent in the bunkhouse. Some, like Anna, felt accepting would be a betrayal of Germany, of their comrades still fighting, of the regime they had served. Others, like Marguerite, felt that refusing would be insulting the first real kindness they had been shown since capture. The debate went in circles until exhaustion settled the question. They would decide individually, each woman following her own conscience. December 25th dawned cold and clear, the kind of day where breath made clouds and frost silvered the ground in shadows. The women woke to silence, no bells calling them to work, no schedule demanding their labor. For the first time in months, the day stretched ahead empty of obligation. Mackenzie appeared at the bunkhouse mid-morning with words that would become the day's refrain. "Today you rest." The women looked at each other, uncertain. Rest felt dangerous, felt like an indulgence they hadn't earned and didn't deserve. Work was familiar, safe in its structure and demands. Rest meant confronting thoughts and feelings they had been pushing aside through constant activity. "We should work," Anna said. "The animals still need care." "Already done," Mackenzie replied. "The hands took care of the morning chores. You ladies have the day off. Read, sleep, walk around if you want. Just rest." He left them in confused silence. Marguerite finally broke it. "I think we have been given a gift. Perhaps we should accept it." The morning passed in strange limbo. Some women slept, making up for months of early mornings and hard labor. Others wrote letters home, trying to explain this bizarre captivity where prisoners were told to rest on Christmas. Marguerite walked out toward the horse corrals, watching the animals move through their own version of rest, and felt something she had almost forgotten: simple peace. Around 3 in the afternoon, Ruth appeared at the bunkhouse with an invitation that felt more like a gentle order. Dinner would be ready at 6, and she expected all 10 women at the table. She wouldn't accept refusal, wouldn't debate their worthiness or propriety. They were coming to dinner, and that was that. The ranch house dining room had been transformed. 2 long tables had been set up to accommodate the crowd: Mackenzie and Ruth, the ranch hands and their families, and the 10 German women. Candles burned in holders that had been in the family for generations. The juniper tree stood in the corner, decorated with ornaments and strings of popcorn that the hands' children had made. The women entered uncertain and overwhelmed. They had not been in a proper home since capture, had not sat at a family table in over a year. The warmth of the fire, the smell of cooking food, the sound of children laughing, it all felt too much, too normal, too impossible given the circumstances. Ruth directed them to seats at the second table, placing them between ranch hands and their families rather than segregating them. Marguerite found herself sitting next to old Charlie, who smelled like leather and tobacco, and regarded her with eyes that had seen most of a century. Anna sat beside James, the young hand with polio, who smiled shyly and helped her with her chair. Mackenzie stood at the head of the table and spoke words that the women would remember forever. "We regathered here because it is Christmas, and on Christmas we remember what matters most: family, faith, and the basic human decency that survives even when the world tries to destroy it. We've got people at this table from different places, different backgrounds, different sides of a war that's torn the world apart. But tonight, in this room, we're just people sharing a meal. Let's be grateful for that." He said a simple prayer, thanking God for food and safety and the hope that the war would end soon. Then the food began arriving from the kitchen. The meal was abundance incarnate: turkey roasted golden, ham glazed with honey, potatoes mashed with butter and cream, green beans with bacon, cornbread that steamed when broken open, cranberry sauce that glowed red as rubies. There were pies pecan, pumpkin, apple, and cookies that Ruth had been baking for weeks. The women stared at the food with expressions approaching disbelief. After years of rationing in Germany, after months of military rations, after the basic but limited food at the ranch, this feast seemed impossible. How could Americans have such abundance while Europe starved? How could the nation they had been taught was weak and failing produce this kind of plenty? "Don't wait for permission," Ruth said gently, seeing their hesitation. "Eat. There's plenty for everyone." Slowly, they began filling their plates. The first bites carried revelation. The turkey was tender and rich. The potatoes were smooth and flavored with butter they could actually taste. The cornbread was sweet and crumbled perfect on the tongue. Marguerite felt tears building behind her eyes. She tried to hold them back, tried to maintain dignity and control, but failed completely. The tears came silent and steady, running down her cheeks while she ate, while she tasted abundance and kindness and a world that seemed fundamentally different from the one she had known. Around the table, other women began crying too. Anna wept openly, her shoulders shaking with sobs she tried to muffle. Others cried quietly, tears mixing with bites of food, grief and gratitude tangled together in ways too complicated to separate. The ranch families pretended not to notice at first, giving the women space for their emotions. But then something remarkable happened. The crying became contagious. Ruth reached for a handkerchief, her own eyes bright with tears. Old Charlie cleared his throat roughly and looked at the ceiling. Even Mackenzie, stern and weathered and not given to sentiment, felt his vision blur. The children noticed and grew quiet, sensing something important was happening, even if they couldn't name it. Young James, sitting beside Anna, awkwardly patted her shoulder, and offered his napkin when she couldn't stop crying long enough to get her own. The tears continued through the meal, not constant but recurring, waves of emotion that would build and break and build again. Between the crying came conversation, halting at first, then gradually more natural. Old Charlie asked Marguerite about Germany in his slow drawl, and she told him about Hamburg before the war, about the port and the ships and the architecture that was now mostly rubble. He listened with attention that felt like a gift, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than interrogation. Miguel spoke some German, learned from neighbors in San Antonio, and he used it to talk with Anna about farming, about the differences between Texas and Bavaria, about whether mesquite trees could grow in German soil. The conversation was simple but real, two people finding common ground in agriculture and weather and the universal challenges of making things grow. Ruth passed around photographs of her sons Thomas in France, Daniel in the Pacific, and the German women looked at young American faces that could have been their brothers, their cousins, their friends in another life. The randomness of who fought for which side, who became enemy and who became ally, felt suddenly overwhelming. "My brother is fighting too," Marguerite said quietly, looking at the photograph of Thomas. "I don't know where. The last letter said he was being sent east to the Russian front." That was 8 months ago. Ruth took Marguerite's hand and held it. "I pray every night that my boys come home safe. I'll pray for your brother too. War doesn't make mothers stop loving their children, doesn't make sisters stop worrying about brothers. This simple acknowledgement that German families loved their soldiers just as American families loved theirs, that suffering was universal rather than particular, broke something fundamental in Marguerite's understanding. The propaganda had taught her that there was a hierarchy of grief, that German suffering mattered more than others, that the war was a noble endeavor rather than a tragedy that destroyed indiscriminately. But sitting at this table, holding the hand of an American woman who promised to pray for an enemy soldier, she understood that propaganda had been lies. There was no hierarchy of suffering. There was just suffering German and American military and civilian victor and defeated, all bleeding the same color, all crying the same tears, all hoping for the same impossible outcome. That people they loved would survive what should have never happened in the first place. After the meal, Mackenzie and Ruth brought out small gifts for everyone present. For the hands and their families, these were practical items, tools, fabric, candy for the children. For the German women, the gifts were simpler but no less meaningful. Each woman received a handkerchief that Ruth had embroidered with their initials, a small gesture that acknowledged their individuality rather than treating them as a collective of prisoners. They received bars of soap that smelled like lavender, a luxury they hadn't experienced since before the war. And they received photographs. The ranch hands had been taking pictures throughout the autumn, and now each woman had images of themselves working, of the ranch, of this strange place that had become their temporary home. Marguerite held the photograph of herself, standing by the horse corral at sunset, the light turning everything gold, and felt her chest tighten. In the image, she looked peaceful. Not happy exactly, but peaceful in a way she hadn't felt in years. The photograph was evidence that even in captivity, even as a prisoner, she could still experience moments of tranquility. Anna received a photograph of herself with one of the young calves she had helped raise from difficult birth to health. She was smiling in the image, genuinely smiling, and she stared at it with confusion because she didn't remember feeling happy enough to smile like that. But the photograph didn't lie. There had been a moment when she forgot she was a prisoner, forgot the war, forgot everything except the simple joy of helping an animal survive. The gifts were met with more tears, more overwhelmed gratitude, more emotion than any of them seemed capable of processing. The women tried to thank Mackenzie and Ruth, tried to find words adequate to express what this day meant, but language failed. How could they explain that this dinner, these gifts, this simple human kindness was reshaping their entire understanding of the world? After dinner, The group moved to the living room where a fire burned in the stone fireplace. The hands pulled out instruments, guitars, a fiddle, a harmonica, and began playing Christmas songs. Some were American carols the women didn't recognize. Others were older European songs that predated nations and wars, melodies that belonged to culture rather than country. When the musicians began playing Silent Night, the German women's breath caught. The carol had been written in Austria, was sung throughout Germany every Christmas, was part of their childhood and their cultural memory. Hearing it played by American ranch hands in a Texas living room created a strange transcendence. The song belonged to everyone and no one, was both intensely familiar and surprisingly new. The women began singing in German, their voices tentative at first, then growing stronger. The melody was the same, even if the words differed, and soon both Germans and Americans were singing together, creating harmony from difference, making music that transcended the war, trying to make them enemies. Marguerite sang with her eyes closed, remembering Christmases before the war, before the regime changed everything, before the world caught fire. She remembered her father's voice carrying the melody, her mother's hand in hers, her brother trying to reach the high notes and failing beautifully. She remembered when Christmas was about peace and joy rather than sacrifice and propaganda. The singing continued through multiple carols, English and German mixed together, voices rough and beautiful blending in the warm room. The children fell asleep on couches and laps. The fire burned low and was rebuilt. Time seemed to stop or become irrelevant, and for those few hours, the war was far away, almost unreal. Late in the evening, after the families with young children had left and only the core ranch household remained, the conversation turned serious. Mackenzie, perhaps emboldened by the day's success, or perhaps feeling words needed saying, addressed the German women directly. "I fought in the last war," he said, his voice carrying the weight of those experiences. "Fought in France, saw things I won't talk about at a Christmas gathering. When that war ended, I swore I'd never hate an entire people again, never reduce individuals to their government's actions. I didn't always succeed at that promise. When this war started, when I heard what was happening in Europe, I felt the old hatreds trying to come back." He paused, looking at the women who were listening with complete attention. "But then you came here. 10 German women who could have been my daughters, who were just trying to serve what they thought was right, who got captured and sent to a ranch in Texas. And I had to choose. Was I going to treat you according to what I felt about your government, or according to who you actually were? You chose to see us as people," Marguerite said quietly. "I tried," Mackenzie acknowledged. "Wasn't always easy. There were days I looked at you and thought about my sons over there fighting, thought about the boys from San Antonio who aren't coming home. But then I'd remember that you didn't start this war any more than my sons did. You all just caught up in decisions made by people with too much power and too little wisdom." Ruth added her own thoughts. "What struck me most was how young you are. Anna, you're barely older than our daughter. Marguerite, you're the same age as our Thomas. When I think about Thomas fighting overseas, I hope that if he were ever captured, someone would treat him the way we've tried to treat you. That's all any of us can do, treat people the way we hope our loved ones are being treated, even when we don't know if that kindness is being reciprocated." Anna spoke up, her English halting but sincere. "Before today, I thought Americans were. The propaganda told us many lies, that you were weak, cruel, that your society was broken. But today I see that we were lied to. This dinner, this kindness, this is not weakness. This is strength we were never taught to recognize." The conversation deepened as the night wore on, moving into territory that was difficult but necessary. The women began asking questions they had been afraid to voice, about what would happen when the war ended, about whether they could ever go home, about what kind of Germany would exist when the fighting finally stopped. Mackenzie was honest, perhaps more honest than official policy would have allowed. Germany was losing, would lose, was perhaps already defeated in every meaningful sense, even if fighting continued. The regime would fall. The country would be occupied. The reconstruction would be long and difficult. What we did was wrong, Marguerite said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise even her. Not just the regime, though that was terrible, but those of us who went along with it, who believed the propaganda or didn't question enough, who let ourselves be used for something evil. We are responsible too. Recognizing that is the first step toward being better, Ruth said gently. Most people never get that far. Most people spend their whole lives defending their mistakes rather than learning from them. But how do we live with it? Anna asked, her voice breaking. How do I go back to Germany knowing that I believed terrible things, supported terrible actions, even if I was young and didn't fully understand? How do I face my family, my future, myself? The same way anyone lives with their mistakes, Mackenzie replied. You acknowledge them, you learn from them, and you spend the rest of your life trying to be better than you were. You can't undo the past, but you can shape the future. When you go back to Germany, you'll help rebuild it. You'll teach the next generation different lessons than the ones you were taught. You'll remember this Christmas and how enemies became something else. Not quite friends maybe, but human beings who shared a meal and found common ground. As midnight approached, the fire burned to embers and exhaustion settled over everyone. The day had been long and emotionally overwhelming, had contained more feeling than any of them knew how to process. Before the women returned to the bunkhouse, Ruth gave each of them a final gift, a small leather-bound journal and a pencil. Write down what you're thinking and feeling, she encouraged. Document this time, these changes, these realizations. Someday, maybe decades from now, you'll want to remember exactly how you felt on this Christmas when the world was turned upside down. The women walked back to the bunkhouse under a sky brilliant with stars. The cold was sharp but clean, clarifying rather than punishing. They moved in silence, each processing the day in their own way, carrying the weight of transformation. In the bunkhouse, they didn't immediately prepare for sleep. Instead, they sat together, speaking in low voices about what had happened. They talked about the food, the gifts, the singing, the conversations. They talked about how kindness had broken down defenses that hostility never could have penetrated. They talked about what it meant to be shown grace when they expected judgment, offered rest when they anticipated only labor. Marguerite opened her new journal and wrote her first entry by lamplight. Today was Christmas, and I experienced something I cannot fully explain. We were treated not as prisoners, but as guests, not as enemies, but as human beings. The Mackenzies and their friends gave us a gift I didn't know was possible. They gave us our dignity back. For months, I have been defined by being a prisoner, by being German, by being on the losing side of a terrible war. But today, I was just Marguerite, a person sitting at a table with other people, sharing food and conversation and even laughter. I do not know what this means for the future. I do not know if I deserve this kindness, but I know that I will never forget it, and I will spend whatever life remains to me trying to be worthy of the grace I was shown this day. The days following Christmas carried a different energy. The women returned to work, but something fundamental had shifted. The labor felt less like punishment and more like contribution. The ranch felt less like a prison and more like a temporary home. The Americans felt less like captors and more like... The women didn't have a word for it, but it was something closer to family than enemy. Mackenzie noticed the change and mentioned it to Ruth one evening. They're working differently now. Not harder exactly, but with more care. Like they're invested in the ranch succeeding rather than just fulfilling obligations. That's what happens when you treat people like people, Ruth replied, with the satisfaction of someone whose theory had been proven correct. They respond to respect with respect, to kindness with care. Christmas showed them that we see them as individuals, and now they're acting like individuals who matter rather than prisoners who don't. Letters the women wrote home after Christmas carried a different tone than previous correspondence. They tried to explain the inexplicable, that their captors had shown them more kindness than they had experienced in years at Christmas dinner, had been more abundant than anything they remembered even from peacetime Germany, that the propagandist's promises about American weakness and cruelty had been exposed as complete lies. Anna wrote to her mother, "I do not know how to explain what is happening to me here. I came to America as a prisoner believing that I would suffer. Instead, I am learning that the beliefs I held were wrong about almost everything. The Americans are not weak. They are strong in ways we are never taught to recognize. They are not cruel. They have shown me more compassion than I knew existed. I am changing, Mother, becoming someone different from who I was. I think I am becoming someone better. When I come home, we will have much to discuss." January and February brought cold that surprised the German women. They had expected Texas to be eternally hot, another assumption proven wrong by reality. The ranch work shifted to indoor tasks and cold weather maintenance. The women learned to break ice on water troughs, to bundle cattle feed against freezing temperatures, to keep equipment functioning despite cold that made metal brittle. But the emotional work continued alongside the physical labor. The women processed what Christmas had meant, what it implied about their beliefs and their future. They talked late into nights about propaganda and truth, about how they had been shaped by ideology and how they could reshape themselves through understanding. Ruth continued the English lessons, but now she included discussions about American government, about the principles the country was founded on, however imperfectly realized, about ideas like equality under law and government, deriving power from the concept of the governed. These concepts were alien to women raised under dictatorship, but they resonated with something fundamental, some human longing for fairness and justice that propaganda had tried to suppress, but never quite extinguished. The women also began teaching Ruth and the interested ranch hands about German culture before the regime, about literature and music and philosophy that had nothing to do with war or politics. They talked about Goethe and Schiller, about Bach and Beethoven, about a Germany that existed beyond the current catastrophe. These exchanges created understanding that went beyond simple enemy-captor dynamics. The Americans learned that Germany was more than its current regime, that German people were more than propaganda caricatures. The Germans learned that America was more complex than they had been taught, that diversity could be a strength rather than weakness, that democracy wasn't chaos, but rather a different way of organizing society that had its own logic and power. When spring finally arrived in late March, bringing warmth and new growth, the ranch experienced something remarkable. The German women began riding horses. Mackenzie had resisted this at first, worried about regulations and escape risks. But Ruth convinced him that teaching these women skills that would make them more useful workers also gave them dignity and purpose that transcended their prisoner status. The lessons started simply, with Marguerite and the two women who had grown up around horses in Germany. But soon all 10 were learning, their confidence growing with each successful ride, their fear transforming into competence. Anna discovered she had a natural talent for riding. The young woman who had arrived fearful and indoctrinated found herself moving across the Texas prairie on horseback, feeling a freedom that existed within constraint, experiencing a joy that had nothing to do with politics or war. The horse beneath her didn't care about nationality or ideology. It responded to her skill and confidence, to the person she was becoming, rather than the soldier she had been. One evening in April, as Anna returned from checking fence lines on horseback, Ruth watched from the ranch house porch and said to Mackenzie, "That girl arrived broken and afraid. Look at her now. She sits a horse like she was born to it, holds her head high, smiles like she means it. We didn't just house a prisoner. We helped a human being remember who she was before the war tried to destroy her." News of Germany's surrender reached the ranch in early May. The women gathered in the bunkhouse, listening to a radio that Mackenzie brought over specifically for this purpose. When the announcement came that German forces had surrendered unconditionally, that the war in Europe was finally over, the women's reactions were complicated beyond description. Relief that the dying would stop, grief for what had been lost and destroyed, fear for families whose fates remained unknown, shame for what their country had done, uncertainty about what came next. The emotions tangled together until separate threads became impossible to identify. Marguerite spoke for all of them when she said, voice breaking, "It's over. God help us, it's finally over." That evening, the Mackenzies invited the women to the ranch house again. There was no feast this time, just simple food and coffee, and the opportunity to talk through what the surrender meant. Mackenzie was careful not to gloat or celebrate. He knew his sons were still fighting in the Pacific, knew the war wasn't truly over yet. But he acknowledged what the day meant for the German women. "You'll be going home eventually," he said. "Might be months, might be longer, but eventually you'll return to Germany. What you find there won't be easy. Your country is defeated, occupied, destroyed in ways that will take decades to rebuild. But you'll have something important to bring with you. You've seen a different way. You've experienced a society that works differently than what you were taught. When you help rebuild Germany, you can use that knowledge to create something better than what existed before." The women remained at the Cross T Ranch through the summer, and into autumn of 1945. The war in the Pacific ended in August, bringing Mackenzie's sons home safely. The ranch celebrated with genuine joy, and the German women shared in that celebration, despite the complicated feelings of knowing their own country as defeat, made this American joy possible. The work continued, but with less urgency now that the war had ended. The women knew their time at the ranch was limited, that repatriation was being organized, that soon they would return to Germany and whatever future awaited them there. They used the remaining time to solidify the lessons they had learned, to prepare themselves emotionally and psychologically for what came next. They wrote more letters home, trying to prepare their families for the changed women who would return. They practiced English until they were fluent. They absorbed everything they could about American society and government and values, knowing this knowledge would be crucial in rebuilding their shattered homeland. Ruth organized a final dinner in November, before the first women were scheduled to leave. It wasn't as elaborate as the Christmas feast, but it carried the same emotional weight. At this meal, the women gave gifts of their own small carved items they had made during spare moments, drawings and paintings depicting the ranch and its people, letters expressing gratitude that no spoken words could capture. "You gave us back our humanity," Marguerite said, standing to address the Mackenzies and the assembled ranch hands. "When we arrived, we were broken prisoners who expected cruelty and hardship. Instead, you showed us kindness and respect. You treated us as individuals rather than enemies." That Christmas dinner was the turning point, but every day since then, you have reinforced those lessons. "We can never repay this debt, but we can promise to carry forward what you taught us. When we rebuild Germany, we will remember the Cross T Ranch and the people who showed us grace we didn't deserve." The women left in groups over several weeks. Marguerite was among the last to go, her language skills making her useful for translation until the final moments. When her turn finally came in December 1945, a year almost to the day after the Christmas dinner that had changed everything, she said her goodbyes with tears that had been building for weeks. Ruth held her for a long moment, this American woman and this German woman who had become something more complicated than friend, but more meaningful than mere acquaintances. "Write to us," Ruth said. "Let us know what happens, how you're doing, what Germany becomes. You're part of our family now, and families stay in touch." Marguerite promised she would. She climbed into the military truck that would take her to the processing center, looking back at the ranch until it disappeared behind rolling hills. She carried her leather journal, now filled with entries chronicling her transformation. She carried photographs of the ranch and its people. She carried gifts and memories and lessons learned through kindness rather than cruelty. Most importantly, she carried a changed understanding of the world, an understanding forged not through propaganda or ideology, but through the simple act of sitting at a table on Christmas Day and being told, "Today you rest." Years later, decades later, the women who had spent time at the Cross T Ranch would tell their children and grandchildren about that Christmas dinner. They would describe the abundance of food, the gifts wrapped in simple paper, the singing that mixed German and English, the moment when enemies became something else. They would explain how they arrived as prisoners expecting cruelty and found instead a kind of grace they hadn't known was possible. They would describe how a rancher and his wife in Texas had shown them that propaganda was lies, that kindness was strength, that human decency could survive even the worst war in history. Most would mention specifically the moment Tom Mackenzie said, "Today you rest," and how those three simple words carried more meaning than any grand speech could have conveyed. Rest was trust. Rest was acknowledgement of their humanity. Rest was the first step toward healing. The women went on to help rebuild Germany, becoming teachers and nurses and administrators in a new democratic society. They used the lessons learned on a Texas ranch to shape a different kind of Germany, one built on principles of democracy and human rights rather than dictatorship and racial hierarchy. Marguerite maintained correspondence with the Mackenzies until Ruth died in 1968, and Tom followed in 1971. The letters chronicled both their lives, births, and deaths, successes and struggles, the slow work of building peaceful lives from war's ruins. In one letter from 1959, Marguerite wrote, "I think of that Christmas dinner often, especially when things are difficult here. I remember what you taught me, that even in the worst circumstances, people can choose kindness over cruelty, can choose to see each other as human beings rather than categories. That lesson has sustained me through everything that came after." Anna became a teacher, specializing in American history and English, passing forward the language skills Ruth had taught her and the understanding of democracy she had absorbed during her captivity. She told her students about the ranch, about learning to ride horses as a prisoner of war, about discovering that the propaganda had been lies about almost everything that mattered. The others scattered across Germany and beyond, carrying with them the memory of a Christmas day when they were told to rest, when they were invited to a table despite being prisoners, when they were shown that grace was possible even between enemies. The story of 10 German women crying at a Christmas dinner in Texas might seem small against the backdrop of World War II's massive destruction, but it represents something crucial about human nature and the possibility of reconciliation even in war's aftermath. The Mackenzies could have treated their prisoners according to strict military protocol, providing adequate food and shelter, but nothing more, maintaining rigid distance between captor and captive, never allowing emotional connection to complicate the clean categories of friend and enemy. That would have been expected, even approved. Instead, they chose something harder and more transformative. They chose to see individuals rather than categories, to recognize that these German women were people who had been caught up in historical forces beyond their control, who had been shaped by propaganda but were not beyond rehabilitation, who deserved dignity despite their nation's crimes. That Christmas dinner was a gift, but not in the simple sense of generosity. It was a gift of recognition, the acknowledgement that even prisoners of war, even members of a regime that had committed atrocities, even enemies, were still human beings who responded to kindness, who could learn and change, who carried within them the capacity for better understanding. The women who cried at that dinner weren't weeping just because of the food, though the abundance after years of deprivation certainly contributed. They cried because the dinner represented everything propaganda had told them was impossible, that enemies could show mercy, that defeat didn't mean annihilation, that there was a way forward that didn't require hatred to persist forever. They cried because they recognized, perhaps for the first time, how completely they had been lied to. If Americans could show this kindness, what else had propaganda gotten wrong? If captivity could include rest and dignity, what did that say about the regime's promises of how enemies would treat them? If these cowboys and ranchers in Texas possessed such moral strength, what did that reveal about the supposed superiority the regime had taught them to believe in? The tears were the sound of propaganda shattering, of worldviews reconstructing themselves, of people becoming capable of truth after years of accepting lies. In the decades after the war, historians would document thousands of prisoner of war camps, millions of individual experiences of captivity, the vast machinery of detention and repatriation. Most of those stories followed predictable patterns: harsh treatment or adequate conditions, strict discipline or reasonable flexibility. But some stories, like that of the Cross T Ranch, revealed something else: the capacity for transformation that exists when people choose to see each other as human beings rather than abstractions. The 10 German women who spent Christmas 1944 at a ranch in Texas carried that lesson for the rest of their lives. They taught it to their children and grandchildren. They used it to help rebuild a nation from ruins. They proved that even in war's darkest hours, even between enemies, grace was possible if people were brave enough to offer it. Tom Mackenzie's words, "Today you rest," became for those women a kind of promise about what the world could be. Not a world without conflict or disagreement, not a utopia free from difficulty, but a world where people could choose. Mercy over vengeance, where dignity could be offered even to those who had fought on the wrong side, where rest was possible even for prisoners. That Christmas dinner didn't end the war or change military policy, but it changed 10 women who went on to change their families, their students, their communities. It demonstrated that the smallest acts of human kindness could carry enormous weight, could shift trajectories, could plant seeds that would grow into forests of different understanding. The women cried at dinner because they recognized grace when they saw it. And in recognizing it, they became people capable of offering that same grace to others, people who would spend the rest of their lives trying to create a world where such kindness was common, rather than extraordinary, expected rather than miraculous. That was the true gift of that Christmas day, not the food or the presents or even the rest, but the revelation that even in the worst war in human history, even between enemies, the choice to see each other's humanity remained possible. And that choice, made by a rancher and his wife on a Texas ranch, echoed across decades and continents, proving that grace, once given, never truly ends.